Oh, and sorry, we are going to be recording this, so if you do not want your image to be captured, you can turn off your video now. Today we'll have two speakers, and they'll both be speaking about transitioning towards more sustainable environmental and social systems via composting. First up is Brenda Platt, who works with the Institute of Local Self-Reliance and is a very experienced composter, policy advocate. And today we'll be talking about local, state, and federal policy advocacy in composting and how you can get your own programs going on the ground. And she will be followed by KT Andresky of Breathe Free Detroit, who has been an activist for a long time. And we'll be talking about community resistance as well as environmental justice and the tie-in between composting and incinerator closures. So how today is going to go is we will have Brenda go, then KT, and then I will do a few questions of Q&A. And during that time, if you've thought of questions during either of the presentations, please put them in the chat, and Adi will be moderating and selecting a few questions at the end from the audience. So we are very thrilled to hear from these champions of composting. And with that, I will leave it to Brenda.
Thanks, Toke. Let me get my my presentation up. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to participate today, and very excited to be joined by KT. So I just wanted to my disclaimer to start off. I am not a lobbyist. I am not an expert on necessarily the strategy around introducing legislation. So today I'm just going to share what I've been doing over the last 10 years or so with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance on documenting policies. And there's such a wide range, which is why I call this a menu of policies at both the local and state level. There's a little bit less that happens at the federal level, but there's some definitely some opportunities right now that are, and I'll talk about the Compost Act that was introduced this summer as well. One of the things I want to emphasize is that in composting, which is taking our food scraps, yard trimmings, and creating this black gold out of it, there is no one way to do it. And that's one of the beauties of composting, is that it can be small scale, worm bin in a classroom, a home composting bin in the backyard, or farm scale, or large scale, and literally everything in between. And so what we found is a lot of the policies really focus and privilege large scale industrial sites and overlook the potential to root some of these composting activities in community. And there's so many benefits of community scale composting, which I won't be able to get in today, but it's job skills, it's engaging youth, it's education, it's keeping the black gold within our local neighborhoods and communities to grow food. And so these are just some examples, and I'd be happy to follow up with a talk in any of your communities about the benefits of community scale composting. Many of you have probably seen, kind of a solid waste hierarchy, if you will, of let's reduce waste first, then let's recycle compost, and then landfilling and burning is last. We have looked at it kind of a different hierarchy and looking at scale and keeping it local. And so, of course, we want to reduce waste. We want to rescue edible food to feed people and also animals after that. But then it's like, we could be in our policies promoting home composting. We could be promoting small scale decentralized, supporting regional farmers and medium scale locally based. And last is really kind of industrialized, centralized composting. So if this is our goal, then we want our policies to reflect that infrastructure. So one of the things we've been doing at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is kind of if you will, cultivating community composting. And we've been doing that through policy resources, but we also have training videos. Our training program is called the Neighborhood Soil Rebuilders Composter Training Program. And we're so happy that it's being adapted in Detroit right now. So we can talk about that too. But we do workshops, forums, we have a podcast, we have a coalition, we have some guides, all about that. I want to just mention we have a series of webinars for community composters, the link's up there, but one of them is that we did with the Sustainable Economies Law Center is Community Compost Law and Policy. So I'll share a few slides on that webinar and the website we created in a few seconds. But one of the other series of webinars we're doing actually right now, we're in the middle of them, is on-farm composting and compost use. So if you're interested in supporting on-farm composting, check these out. There's actually one tomorrow on profiting with compost and the importance of compost quality. So let's get into policy. So we've been tracking composting policy, particularly policies that in some way support a distributed infrastructure. So what we've got here, we have a map, and we'll put the link in the chat or send it to you afterwards, but we've got, you can click on zoning policies, you can click on acts, you can click on, this is local policies, contract policies, incentives, and it'll come up where those policies are. And then we do the same for state policies. So in state policies, there's permitting exemptions for farmers, that there may be food residuals disposal ban. So check out that composting for community map. The map also kind of tracks where community composters are operating, and we do have that kind of, and we're still building this out. So, you know, there's like about 24 bike haulers that collect food scraps with bikes. So you can just see where those are located around the country. The other thing we have is we have this rules library, composting rules library. And there we categorize the rules according to what they're promoting. So we have, I had to move my Zoom bar out of the way so I can see this. But so we have, there's a lot of states that ban yard trimmings from landfills. We have policies that require the procurement, the buying of finished compost. We used to say in the recycling world, if you're not buying back recycled content products, you're not closing the recycling loop. Well, the same is true for compost. And compost amended soil requirements. I'll talk a little bit, give you some examples. If you're a builder and you're disturbing soil, that basically says, hey, you can't put back subsoil. You have to add organic amendments to that soil to make sure it's healthy, and compost is part of those soil requirements. So it's another form of procurement. We're seeing more food scrap recovery policies, but sometimes those policies are driving towards large scale industrial. Permit exemptions for sites that are promoting on-farm composting is really important. We want performance-based permit regs. And then there's some other policies that are kind of coming up on promoting soil health and carbon sequestration, which I think are really important as well, because it ties why we're composting back to soil health and becoming a carbon sink. And then I'll finish up with some examples on waste surcharges, which I think is something we're beginning to look at now. So so food scrap policies, they're both state and local. So there's a bunch of states that are banned, that are requiring large food waste generators to do something with their food waste. They can reduce it, they can rescue it to feed people. These include Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, Maryland just passed one earlier this year, but we also have some examples of this at the local level. So Austin, Texas is an example of having a requirement for food scraps. They have a universal recycling ordinance, which led to its zero waste plan. It's being enacted. I would say the city on the local level that was probably the first out of the gate to require households and businesses compost was San Francisco. But before you can do that, you have to actually have a program in place. I believe you can't require people to do it if you don't have a good program, in which they did for many years. I think one of the easiest policies, easy in air quote, to pass is policies to promote buying compost. So if it's hard in your town or your state to get requirement that generators have to compost, or you have to set up a program, usually you can at least get a procurement policy in place. And these again can be within an entity. A university could do it. Your local county or town could pass a procurement policy. You could require your here, this DOT is Department of Transportation. So in New York, they're required to do it. Maryland, we got a bill passed. But King County is one of the local models where part of their procurement, they have different aspects of it. So you can go to our website and see. But again, this idea for post-construction soil standard, you have to use compost. And that is driving the market within that community. I've been a real fan of these compost amended soil requirements, which the idea is we really want to increase soil organic matter. The U.S. Composting Council, which is an industry association, has a goal to get 5% by volume of soil organic matter into soils. And some of these local communities that have done that, like in Texas, it's been driven by drought conditions. In Washington state, it's been driven by a lot of rain and needing to manage stormwater. So whether you're in a part of the country that's got drought or heavy rain, having organic matter in your soil is a benefit. And these vary. Like in Leander, Texas, the requirement is that all new landscapes are required to have a minimum of 6 inches of soil depth in areas planted with turf grass, and that has to consist of 25% compost. In Greeley, Colorado, if you're installing a new lawn, you also have to incorporate so much volume of compost and so forth. So King County, Washington, Seattle, other examples. And in Seattle, they have a guide to how you do that. So that's one important policy. In New York State just passed this year a Soil Health and Climate Resiliency Act, and it was informed in part by this study that came out on characterization of soil health. And as part of that, that study, they noted that compost is an important element in building soil organic matter. And so that's one of the accepted practices for healthy soil in New York. So we'll see about funding, and we expect more of those kinds of state policies to come down the pike, pushing for healthy soils. With the Sustainable Economies Law Center, we worked with them to produce this website on compost law and policy. So do check that out. The website breaks down kind of rulemaking, legislation, some of the policy that's related to bids and contracts you can work on. One of the things we found is, and I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, is that when you look at the spectrum of policies that are out there, we see, and even programs, we see that a lot of the, it's done as kind of is oriented towards privileging large-scale sites, and this kind of school, small-scale, farmers market, on-site, farm cooperatives, all this middle portion of what's possible in composting is often overlooked. So we really could be doing a lot more to promote that. And there's a guide that they have, a set of slides on that website. We did a webinar back in June 2018 that's recorded, you can look at, that really kind of goes through that we are still in this movement of now is a really timely time right now to lay the groundwork for policy advocacy. We've been creating shared definitions of what community composting is, compost cooperatives. We've been raising the bar on best management practices for community composters. We've been highlighting some of the different approaches like we're doing right now with you all about exemptions and policies to promote community composting and on-farm composting. And this, I think there's a lot more room for work in this. I just want to mention this kind of idea of rights-based, that we should be advocating for the basic human right to healthy soil, and compost is about that process. And we should have the right to do it within our local communities and neighborhoods and green our urban and rural communities. And we need more incentive programs because it's really all about following the money. So I know I just have a few more minutes, so let me just share some other examples of policies towards that end. So we've been documenting states that have exemptions for farmers to make it easier for farmers to do it, and looking at supportive rules in general for small scale composting. And there's some examples here. Recently this year, We had a win in Montgomery County, Maryland with a zoning amendment. So some of these can be done at the local level as well. I live in Maryland, work in the DC metro area. So I've been working for more than a decade to advance composting policy in Maryland. And it has been a slow slog, let me tell you. We started with the bill in 2011, which we really wanted some clear permitting, a kind of a regulatory roadmap. It took a few years to get that. They started in 2011. It wasn't the new permitting roadmap wasn't actually released in 2015. But in the meantime, we got requirements that the State Highway Administration had to spec use of compost and compost-based products. That was good. In 2017, we made clear that you can't just, you had to meet standards if you're going to label, something as compostable or biodegradable. We tried to get food requirements for large food waste regenerators to do something to recover their food waste, but that led to a study group, which I am not a huge fan of. But then we got a bill passed this year requiring, we finally, after studying it for a few years, 4 years, we got a bill passed that actually did do the requirements. We also got a bill that allows condos and homeowners associations, if you're there, to be able to have the right to home compost or subscribe to service. And we also repealed a bad law that allowed incineration to count as composting and recycling. I'll just say beware study groups, because to me, it's a delaying tactic. We did write into the bill specific things we wanted the study group to look at, including encouraging decentralized and diverse infrastructure, but they basically did nothing on that. So I just found it was a delaying tactic. I'm a big fan of starting local. And, in Montgomery County, we had some success with that the Montgomery County, Maryland bill we passed in 2016 required a strategic plan. And it was probably the first bill in the country that wrote into the bill that you had to consider home composting, community scale composting, on-farm composting, and so forth. And that did lead to a strategic plan a couple years later that incorporates all of those things. So I know I am at time right now, Toke, so I think I will just stop there and we will, I'll hand the mic back to you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. So if you all in the audience have questions, please drop them in the chat. You have about 25 minutes to do so for Brenda's talk. KT is going to talk next about composting as resistance, and we're really excited.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. That was such a wealth of knowledge.
So I'm going to be sharing screen for KT, so I'm going to pull that up just now.
Yep. I want to also thank GAIA and Brenda for, this amazing panel and really showing up on what is being discussed today. I've learned quite a bit already. All right. So I'm going to be talking to you all about composting at home as an act of resistance. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. For those who don't know, Breathe Free Detroit is a community and grassroots-led campaign that was formed to shut down the Detroit incinerator, which is also called Detroit Renewable Power. And it's the largest municipal waste incinerator in Michigan, with a long history of emission violations. Detroit burned its trash and the waste from many outside communities for over 33 years here in my neighborhood. Are funding organizations of Zero Waste Detroit, East Michigan Environmental Action Council, the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center, and the Ecology Center worked with the communities living around the incinerator for over a decade. After 33 years of community activism from many organizations along the way, it was announced on March 27th, 2019, that the Detroit Renewable Power incinerator would be closed for good. So that was a massive victory for us and our neighbors living near this major source of air pollution. What we're continuing to do is engage our community and pursue environmental justice through our work in just transitions for the residents that live around the facility, just transition for the workers who lost their jobs, and a just transition for the newly directed waste stream. So next slide. One of the projects that we're participating in right now is we're actually leading the Diane Marie Taylor Zero Waste Composting Pilot, which is a residential pilot program for the city of Detroit. And this is one of 3 pilots in a decentralized composting pilot program. The 2 additional pilots are working with urban farms, a local university, and varying collection techniques to advance multi-scale composting. This program and the 3 pilots is made possible through the funding of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and support from the Eastside Community Network, Detroit City Council's Green Task Force, and our other grant partners, Food Plus Detroit Sustainable Community Farms and the Mother Earth Foundation in the Philippines. And I just want to make a note, Diane Marie Taylor was a community member living here a mile east of the incinerator and was a champion for composting, for backyard composting citywide, and also getting the city to do a citywide pickup. She passed away in 2020, so we're dedicating this pilot to her in her name. So next slide. So a little bit about the background. Our pilot program is a foundation to inform and implement multi-scale citywide composting policies in Detroit by reflecting current community efforts. Breathe Free Detroit is taking a community-led advocacy approach to ending climate inequities and environmental injustices through work toward just transitions for future generations to thrive. Currently, the composting of Detroit's waste is mostly in the form of yard waste only. There are many urban farms across the city that do small to mid-sized composting on their own, and many residents have backyard compost bins. In creating policy for citywide composting, the Detroit City Council's Green Task Force Organics Recycling Committee is preparing to protect all sizes of compost operations from backyard to municipal scales. So that one large composting contract doesn't wipe out all of the individual efforts. Go to the next slide. So our community-led approach to this policy is that globally we know that environmental justice communities are leaders in creating solutions for climate justice. Many environmental justice communities implement these solutions out of resistance and are experts in knowing what to do next. So many community members living near the Detroit incinerator who fought to shut it down because of the health effects seen across our community that still exist today. Our community members here are co-creators and co-facilitators of this pilot to strengthen the multi-scale decentralized composting for the city of Detroit. This pilot was designed for communities located near the now closed incinerator to lead in the backyard composting pilot program, as well as small-scale community garden compost unit management. So many of the participants of this pilot have played a significant role in fighting to shut down the incinerator and work to starve the beast by increasing recycling rates and composting efforts within our community way before the incinerator was shut down. We have been practicing zero waste as an act of resistance years before the incinerator closed, and we'll continue to do this as a lead in residential pilots. So this pilot really provides an opportunity to show policymakers the importance of listening to and supporting community efforts. I want to uplift this poster on the right a little bit. This is a photograph just down the street. And it's of a trash can before we even had a citywide pickup for recycling. And an artist went over and spray painted onto it. It says, "When I grow up, I want to be a recycling container." And now that street is filled with recycling containers and many composters as well. So next slide. So just for folks that might not really know much about the decentralized multi-scale systems, I wanted to clarify the decentralized composting systems rely on thriving multi-scale composting. So most US cities adopt, and this is what Brenda was mentioning earlier, is that they adopt large scale composting systems, also known as municipal scale systems. And these systems normally rely on single company composting facilities that pick up compostable goods from restaurants and residents and then truck it usually 40 to 100 miles outside of the city to process. A decentralized multi-scale composting system relies on small to medium scale facilities that collect compostables locally. These facilities are spread throughout a city's districts and neighborhoods so that they can stay local, allowing the compost facility to grow locally, hire locally, collect locally, and redistribute fully processed compost to local homes and gardens. This system extremely reduces the CO2 as trucks are not traveling as far and sometimes not even at all. So this pilot is made to examine how much waste we can reduce from our landfill without the need of any truck by composting in our backyards and community gardens. The other pilots are working with larger scale farms, universities, and collection techniques to increase commercial small scale efforts. So if a decentralized multi-scale composting system is adopted in Detroit, it would create many local jobs and decrease truck traffic and emissions from our waste pickup, and provide healthy soil amendments for community and city-led gardens, green spaces, and water retention efforts to decrease flooding and water contamination. So next slide. So I just wanted to give you all a kind of a general overview of the Detroit's waste stream. So on the left is where Detroit's waste is going today. And on the right is what waste is remaining and not being diverted into zero waste systems. So as you can see, we have a ton of work to do. In 2021, this year, only 5% of Detroit's waste is recycled, and only 36% of our residents have a recycle bin. We have an opt-in program, so you have to actually opt in to receive recycle bin. It's not just given to you to use right away. So Detroit sends all wastebound for disposal, which is the 91.6% on the left, to landfills now that it's not going to an incinerator. So a total of 5% of our municipal solid waste is diverted for recycling. And that breaks down to 1.6% is collected through municipal curbside and drop off, and 3.3% that is collected through our bottle redemption program. Our compost diversion accounts for 3.5% of our municipal solid waste, and most of that is in our yard waste pickup program. So this data is from GAIA's recent report, A Tale of 5 Cities, Plastic Barriers to Zero Waste, which you can find on their website. And I want to express the importance of zero waste reports like this that focus on cities like Detroit, because we know why composting is the way forward as practitioners and zero waste advocates and incinerator fighters. But the policymakers of cities like Detroit seem to think that their city is different. And what works in other cities, what works in other cities is that more progressive cities in other more progressive cities won't work here in Detroit. And to some extent, they're correct, right? We can't compare our zero waste efforts efficiently to the long time efforts happening in San Francisco, as idealistic as it may be, because cities like Detroit need comparisons to other winter bound cities with similar weather like Minneapolis, or learn from other Rust Belt cities like Baltimore who increase their zero waste efforts through the challenges that they face with a similar exhausted city budget like Detroit has. So these kinds of examples present a much more realistic comparison for Detroit in our efforts to create and adopt new policy. An increased focus on building policy in these cities is not only beneficial for the region, but also creates relatable comparisons for so many other cities. At the same time, there are few examples in the US of city-supported policy for multi-scale community-led composting initiatives, as you learned earlier. Our pilot will influence these policies that are adopted for this type of citywide composting. Next slide. So right now, just a broader picture of the state of Michigan, we're kind of revising our solid waste bill, and it's stuck in the state legislature. It's dying in the state legislature, but we've had our hopes up still. But we're still exploring what multi-scale composting looks like, and as a policy for Detroit, and it's a slow process, and that's just how legislation works, right? So we're working in parallel to these proposed changes of Part 115, which is Michigan's 8-bill package that proposes changes to statewide solid waste laws. And it's important to continue work on these policies if they're adopted right away or even just later down the line. Strengthening policy takes time, and we most likely will not see the best practices adopted in the first go around. For incineration, is still an option for solid waste management in this current version of Part 115. So there's always more work to do. Updating Michigan solid waste policy and laws is an important part of this equation. So we're folding it into our pilot as we go. The current laws focus on the ability of disposal capacity, and we've chosen to invest here in Michigan in landfills, and we have really cheap tipping fees, and so we attract trash. Stakeholders have worked together for years to identify a set of recommendations to guide the rewrite of this Part 115, and those recommendations are what is currently sitting in the state Senate. So hopefully we'll see some movement on it, but we've been really hoping for months now. Next slide. Thank you. So I wanted to share this image with you all. And although this image shows only recycling rates, it brings up many other issues that Michigan faces in solid waste management. We're one of the cheapest states for dumping waste per ton in this area. So other states around us and Canada send us their trash, and that includes hazardous waste. That also comes to our neighborhood. Our state has invested more in dumping and burning waste than it has in zero waste efforts. So I don't have a map comparing composting rates for these Great Lakes states, but I expect it to be similar to this. The saddest part about these low zero waste diversion rates in Michigan in terms of composting is that we could do so much more to support our diverse agriculture here. Michigan grows more variety of crops than any other state outside of California. And if we invested in composting infrastructure, it would reduce the use of fertilizers that leak into our waterways, increase healthy soils that can hold onto water in increasing flooding events, and provide more nutrients for fruits and vegetables grown here, allowing a healthier system for the people who eat it. We face these serious conditions of climate change while California's historic droughts and fires create an increased demand in food production in places like Michigan. So I'd love to see composting prioritized throughout the entire Great Lakes region, as we provide 21% of the world's surface fresh water. Composting can reduce agricultural runoff and use of fertilizers that many times end up in our lakes. So we need to be more prepared to support our farmers and crop production changes and challenges happening globally. And decreasing food waste in our landfills and incinerators is part of this solution. Next slide. So I just really wanted to push this. I can't even be presenting here without really acknowledging water injustices. We have so many injustices here in Michigan, in cities like Detroit, Flint, and Benton Harbor, and growing in homes across the US that, you know, we don't have enough accessible drinking water that's clean for folks to be able to rely on. And composting improves water quality, water retention, and aids in water restoration. So water warriors across the globe are protecting our human rights for clean, drinkable, accessible, and affordable water. And water is life, and we can work to protect it through composting, as composting is part of water justice. And I just really want to uplift that because it's all intertangled, and not just agriculture, but even just our clean drinking water and the health of our communities. Next slide. So in closing, our schools, our backyard, a community garden, farms, and even your municipality can use compost as an act of resistance to climate change. So I believe it will take a multi-scale decentralized approach to receive the environmental support needed to make these changes. Each scale is important and should be supported through funding, infrastructure, and supportive policies. Everyone should be composting as a radical act to protect the planet and practice zero waste. So thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it back to Tok.
Thank you, Katie. Oh, sorry, having feedback. All right. So we are going to do a few questions of Q&A. Adi, do you mind putting up that slide when you have a second? And in the meantime, I just want to say thank you so much to both of our speakers, as well as to Adi for organizing this digital series, and Jenny, who is supporting with tech, as well as Zoe, who is supporting with communications. So from the GAIA team, thank you all so much. So if you haven't already, please put your questions in the chat. We are going to go for about 10 minutes with moderator Q&A. So first, KT, can you tell us about the first steps Detroit took in implementing a successful incinerator closure campaign and why building up composting infrastructure became necessary in the wake of that victory?
Yeah, thank you. There were so many different things that we did to shut down the incinerator. I call it like a death by 1,000 cuts, right? There were so many years that folks were fighting this thing from even before it was built. So there was everything from, we were air quality monitoring, we were going door to door, we were really reaching out to the community to get them involved in understanding, what that smell was, what it was doing to our health, that we were all experiencing the negative effects of it. We have a lot of resources on our website that really helped get the information out. One-page flyers that are based off of a Detroit Incinerator Primer report. But the really big thing that pushed it was there's a Clean Air Act rule that if your government entities are not fining the facility for what it needs to be fined for, and we had hundreds of violations, and our MDEQ was not giving these fines to the incinerator as much as they should. So we ended up standing in as a citizen lawsuit, and it was about 5 days before that suit was going to be filed. They had a letter of intent to sue 60 days before that, and 5 days before we were putting that lawsuit forward, they shut down because they realized they couldn't continue operating without polluting the community around them. And, a big part of that was, those, death by 1,000 cuts was increasing our recycling rates and increasing our composting rates, especially within the community that lived around there, because we knew that anything we put into our trash bins would end up coming back to us in what we were breathing. It came back to us in terms of asthma and other respiratory issues. So composting and reducing the waste that went in there was really a big part of our activism here. Yet the city of Detroit was not prepared. They didn't even know that the facility was shutting down. The workers didn't even know that until the day that it shut down. So these facilities are not looking out for the betterment of a city or even their workers, right? They're definitely not good neighbors. So when they shut down, it was kind of a surprise for everybody. And the zero waste efforts really popped after it shut down. Like city council seemed to wake up and say, wait a second, Why aren't we recycling more now that we have to pay for this to be landfilled? So it did create that big change when it shut down. I wish we had more foresight in making sure that shift would have been easier for everybody. But here we are.
Thank you so much. I think Brenda talked a little bit about the importance of earlier, like building up of zero waste, even as we are transitioning. Brenda, can you also talk about the first steps you took in coordinating a successful zero waste campaign legislatively at the state level in Maryland, and why you might choose to work at a particular level of government, be it local, state, or federal, in approaching policy changes?
Yeah, well, there's several things I want to say. One, if you're interested in working at the state level, it can take several years. I mean, Katie, you talked about the bill you're working on stagnating. So, I do think getting it introduced, going to your own delegates in your own district and asking them to introduce things. I mean, you would be surprised. They want to hear from their constituents. So, do reach out to your own elected officials and push them. I think strategically, it's also good these bills often are heard in committee levels first. So you want to find who are the delegates on those environment committees, or hopefully it's not on a finance committee, and get those delegates or elected officials to be the sponsors, because you need bills to get out of committee before it can be heard by the full House or the full Senate. So that's one strategy. But back to this question of local first, I'm a big fan of boots on the ground local. And I'm just going to share a kind of project I did a number of years ago with a young activist club in my little town, Tacoma Park. And their campaign was no polystyrene, which is styrofoam, right? No polystyrene campaign. And in 2014, the kids got the local town to pass a ban. And then later that year, the school district finally capitulated and replaced the styrofoam lunch trays. And then 2 years later, the county, which, the town is 16,000, but the county is like 1 million, passed a styrofoam ban. And then in 2019, 3 years after, and then DC, which is nearby, the District of Columbia passed a ban. The neighboring county, Prince George's, which is another 1 million people, passed a ban. And then 3 years later, in 2019, Maryland became the second state. I think Maine was the first to pass a statewide ban on food service styrofoam, which went into effect this year. So what are the lessons learned from that? Local works, even just a small town, it can spread to other counties and towns. And then often state policy is based on what's happening at the local level. And this is clearly the case in California. I mean, you take San Francisco demonstrated that businesses can compost. And now the state has a lot of statewide legislation requiring businesses to offer the service. And I don't think some of those state policies would have passed if it wasn't proven kind of feasible at the local level. So working at the local level, I think, is foundational.
Thank you so much. And to broaden this, you sometimes speak about policy as more than just pieces of legislation. Can you talk about that idea a bit more and why it's important to keep in mind?
Yeah, so, I briefly mentioned like contracts, right? So your town has a lot of purchasing policy ability that's not just ordinances or a municipal code, right? So and I think KT, you talked on about this too. Like, so if you're gonna contract for recycling or composting service, if that contract is just written so like, oh, the only people who can, businesses who can respond to that bid have to do recycling, solid waste, and food scraps, well, then you're only the big boys, the big trash companies are going to qualify. And you've just basically eliminated all those guys that are collecting food scraps on bikes maybe in your community who can keep it local. So how your city does contracting, setting up is important. So that's just one example. And purchasing policies could be another. It's not necessarily legislation. Your city could be, buying compost or mulch from like 3 states away. But if the city had a purchasing policy, and I used King County as an example earlier as one of the best kind of local examples of a county, purchasing compost back. So it's just broader than legislation. And I'll just say one other thing, I didn't get to it, but you know, it's also, you don't have to like work with your city, county, or state to do everything. Like in the District of Columbia, I mean, there's a bunch of legislation we help to work on, but one example is the city, we got the city to pass a home composting incentives act, which just basically clarified, because there's archaic language on the books, like you have the right to compost in the city on your own property, as long as you don't, you know, create public nuisances, odors, rodents and whatnot. But the act also said, we're going to offer training and we're going to give you a rebate up to $75 to offset the cost of your home composting bin. So there are smaller chunks of this bigger policy pie, if you will, that could be promoted that may be a little bit easier than, okay, we're going to offer curbside collection to every single household and apartment building in our town. So that's why, you know, there's lots of you have lots of options. Just hopefully your local community or state can get on the path with at least something. There's no excuse not to do anything in my mind.
I feel like that's going to be really helpful to a lot of people who are on this Zoom today. And definitely for me as well to think about. Katie, do you mind talking about the idea of composting as an act of resistance and why you and others have embraced this?
Yeah, thank you. So the community that I live in and work within here, you know, we're just a mile east of the incinerator, right? It's not closed, which is amazing. But when it was in operation, the wind here in Detroit blows east. So we are one of the hardest hit communities of health issues from that incinerator. And for any community that lives near an incinerator, or even any community that lives around a landfill, or in an incinerator ash landfill, or anything that has to do with waste, when you're composting and you're taking your own food and you're keeping it in your backyard or walking it across the street to your community garden, you are resisting the pollution that ends up in an incinerator, or coming from an incinerator, or coming from a landfill. And you're also reducing the amount of you know, CO2 pick up all of your trash, you know, and truck it wherever outside, you know, like sometimes hundreds of miles out. So by just taking your weight in food waste to your backyard, you're really doing quite a bit. And I think that we really need to support that as an individual effort to resist climate change and to support healthy communities.
Thank you so much. That was beautifully described, and yeah, well said. So for both of you, do you mind sharing one piece of advice you would give to people who want to expand composting in their cities or towns? We could start with KT.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's really important. We're really disconnected from policymakers right now. And composting is something that we can become experts of in our own home and in our own backyard. And we don't have to wait for policy makers to do it in our own backyard and to do it well, or to learn how to do it well. So I would say just get started. Start it in your own home and see what happens. If you don't have a backyard, you know, grab some worms and learn that way. It's really fun to just, you know, create better and better soil as you go on. And then you can, you know, start writing your policymakers, start writing your public officials and giving them a call and telling them this is what you want to see in your community. And I really agree with Brenda, start small and see, because it is something that, you know, compost just keeps building and building some more soil, and we're losing that every year. We're losing good soil. So it's important for us to even start small.
Yeah, and I would echo KT. You know, I think if I had to pick one thing, it's really fight for a diverse and distributed infrastructure. You know, we need home composting, we need community scale, and we probably will need some larger facilities. I just don't like that they always get built first, right? So fight for diverse and distributed infrastructure, where you have some that are rooted in community for sure, and then fight against policies that privilege large scale industrial. And I think with the infrastructure bill that just got passed, and with the Build Back Better that's coming, there's going to be a lot of money flowing, and we should be grabbing that money. It's always about follow the money. So that's a big fight. That's, I think, hopefully not a fight, but talk to your elected officials and find out where that money's flowing to, and if you can get it for local programs, whether it's a home composting training program or community farms, your schools. I think there's so much power with the next generation with youth right now, and this is one area where every school should have a garden if they can, and every school should be connecting food, soil, climate, compost, that closed loop. And so let's get some of that money flowing to schools and education, because young composters become old composters.
Yes, love that. Awesome. Well, now we're going to transition to Adi answering questions from the audience, or sorry, moderating the questions from the audience that Katie and Brenda will then answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Toke. So I saw one question from someone in the audience, from Marilyn, about problems with rats. And, I do advocacy around some of this in New York City, and that is a concern that comes up quite a lot. So I guess generally, how would you suggest zero waste organizers address common concerns with the surrounding community when bringing up larger scale community-based composting, including pests and odors? Yeah,
I can take that real quickly. And by the way, New York City has one of the best rat academies. So I encourage, and I think because it's gone virtual, anybody can take it now. So check it out. But, the rodents are here. The rats are here, and they're only going to get worse with global warming, climate, disruption. But, our open dumpsters, our public trash cans, our overflowing household bins, they're like 5-star restaurants for rodents. So we're just feeding them now. And one healthy female rat can have 80 offspring a year. So it's exponential growth. So the way we address it is head on. And we need to educate. And I don't know why we don't have more rodent prevention as just part of our curriculum in general. But, there's definitely, when we do our composting trainings, we talk a lot about how to compost successfully at the home, at the community level, without having rodent problems. So that would be another whole workshop.
Adi, was that all the audience questions?
Well, KT, do you have anything to add? Like, what's worked in Detroit?
Yeah, so I mean, to be honest, we've had more rat problems at the incinerator site than we do in our community compost sites here. We do have, neighborhood cats and rat terrier dogs that keep them away from our residents' households. But, one of the things that we're really looking more into is the right type of containers for our backyard units. We're learning, things along the way about, like, a rat can get into a 1/2 inch area. So if you have a hole 1/2 inch, it can come in and out, and a mouse can get in 1/4 inch, and that's not a ton of space. But like Brenda said, some of these garbage cans are just wide open, and so I think it really just having us understand how to build systems that are rat resistant and rodent resistant is important for us to know how to move forward with the best practices.
Cool. Well, thanks both of you. One more question. Are there any upcoming issues in organics management that are on your radar that you feel like people should be aware of in this audience?
Well, there was a question that came in about in the Q&A on considering on how to avoid privatizing a transfer station. And I'll just say, I'm not going to directly address that, but just to your question, Audie, as well, is that I'm a big fan of surcharges on waste disposal because the price of disposal doesn't often reflect its cost. And there are like 8 states that have surcharges on disposal. They range from $2 a ton to like more than $10 a ton. And what those do is, and they can cover waste transfer stations too. So, and they can, and those 8 states, the money they collect goes into a grant program that then can fund infrastructure projects for, not just composting, but reduction, repair, recycling, and so forth. So I think we need to assess a surcharge on and spread this as a policy mechanism so we can get money flowing to local government and farmers and others to build the infrastructure we need at the local level. So I think that's one thing that I'll be working on. We're doing some research now. We'll be publishing it on our website and be looking at introducing similar legislation in other states.
Great, thanks. And real quick, KT, do you have anything to add?
I'd like to just really agree with Brenda. We have in Michigan one of the lowest tipping fees for our trash. And if we could even increase that so that, we can have better systems of zero waste supported, it's just ripe for that type of change, right? I also just want to uplift, what we talked about today is really creating policies for decentralized systems to make sure that these resources stay in our communities and aren't just shipped out to another city to be processed in a large scale, hurting communities around. These huge facilities aren't necessarily healthy facilities with their big, the big way that they go about it. They're like large trucks and everything. So, sorry, that's not a horse, it's my dog. I also want to really uplift how much carbon can sequester, or how much carbon can be sequestered in composting efforts. So increased composting efforts at an agricultural level can really do a lot of change, and there's a lot of amazing information out there. And it's an entirely different webinar to be talking deeply about this, but I'm very excited to explore that more.
Thanks, guys. I'll hand it back over to Toke to close us out.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you, KT. Thank you, Brenda. And yeah, KT, that's a beautiful closing note. Just the underexplored potential of composting. We can all imagine and work towards a world where that's a more ingrained part of our local communities and broader waste systems, as well as, starting with reduction and donation and, looking at the zero waste hierarchy as Brenda described at the beginning of this. So I want to thank everyone in the audience. We'll be following up. And I just want to also thank, again, Adi and Jenny and Zoe from GAIA. And we will be starting an organics and food working group for organizations to be a part of. So if you're interested in that, you can contact us or be on the lookout for more communications from us about that. Yeah, and have a great rest of your afternoon. My power just came back on. I was having a lot of tech issues, so sorry about that, but it's all better now at the end of the talk. Yeah, everyone have a good day.